At the close of World War II, a clash of political and social ideologies called the Cold War erupted between the United States and the USSR. Disputes over territory ravaged by World War II resulted in what came to be known as the Iron Curtain, through which little trade or free travel could take place. The ensuing struggle lasted for nearly half a century, focusing the world's attention on the centers of two superpowers, one based in Washington, D.C., and one in Moscow. Ensuing in 1950, in an often forgotten corner of the Arctic, where the distance from Alaska to the USSR is a scant few miles across the Bering Sea, another curtain was dropped, the ice curtain. This ice curtain cut off social and family ties between native Alaskans and Siberians, who had freely communed with each other dating back into prehistory. The ice curtain changed the Bering Sea region in ways often not realized by many, including leading scholars of the Cold War. For thousands of years, the ancestors of native Alaskans patrolled the beaches and hills of the Alaskan coastal wilderness in search of sea and land mammals for sustenance. At the creation of the Alaska Army National Guard, the coastal Alaska natives were well prepared to fit the boots of Alaskan guardsmen.
My name is Igor Krupnik. I work at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. I'm curator of Arctic ethnology, and I've worked in the Bering Strait region for over 35 years. Every boy was from the very beginning trained at building up very powerful hunter, a person who can paddle for hours, a person who could walk on the moving ice. You have to be able to carry enormous load, because when people kill walrus and butcher the walrus, they often carry walrus meat on their back, and these are 80, 100, 150 pound pieces of meat and skin. So those people are to be real fit for everything they encountered on their way, which by default made them very well prepared for war. Every community kept guards practically all the time. They had people watching, like sentinels watching from the high ground.
Leo Rasmussen, a former mayor of Nome, is one of the early guardsmen.
They didn't have to train them how to shoot a gun and hit a target. They didn't have to train them on how to find something. They'd already known how to find polar bears, walrus, which were far more sleuthful than the human being that they would encounter later on. I knew that if I ever had to go into combat with those individuals or on any special assignment, that I was going with as good a unit as there was in the US, period.
Every time you put a curtain, whether it's iron curtain or ice curtain or any restriction on their travel, you make a tremendous harm to their culture, because that culture is built upon exchange, marriages, storytelling, exchange of dances. That's the way the culture thrives.
Natives living in the Soviet Union were forcibly relocated by the Soviet government. When this news reached Alaskan villages that their Russian relatives had been relocated from their ancestral homelands, the fear that the same treatment would befall them spread. But thanks to several determined military strategists who believed that the native skills and abilities could blend seamlessly with the U.S. military, the native Alaskans came to form one of the world's premier Arctic combat forces and the state's first line of defense against Soviet aggression. The Alaska Army National Guard had armories in over 100 villages across the state of Alaska, with a majority of them located in close proximity to the Bering Sea and our former Cold War enemy, the Russians. This is their story.
My name translated means one slain in battle, Kajakti. My Western culture name is Walter A. Sobolev. I was in the National Guard for 20 years, and what an honor and a challenge. You had to be sworn in and promise you will give your life for your country. There was no question. They knew what they were getting into, and they were willing to give, because they learned that they are now American citizens and they had to defend the causes of democracy. Freedom of speech, freedom of worship. They were willing, and they liked it. It helps them to become useful citizens. And in return, it makes for a better democracy. This is America. And the National Guard is part of that picture that brings people together.
After World War II, military interests turned to looking at threats from the Western Pacific to threats from the Arctic North. In 1945, the Soviet Union began establishing airfields in northern Siberia, bringing Soviet bombing distances 1,000 miles closer to the east coast of the United States than before. Suddenly, the Soviet Union presented a significant threat of attack on North America. Alaska, lying in the path of this potential attack route, became a strategic interest.
My name is Alexander Dolitsky. I was born and raised in the Soviet Union. Today I'm a director of the Alaska Siberia Research Center, that is a non-profit organization. Not long ago, 20 years ago, there were about 25,000 troops or border guards in Providenia and Chukotka region.
We knew that Russia had Alaska as one of its targets. And we knew that Alaska could be struck. Whatever would happen would indeed be very serious. And we were willing to do our part to defend.
My name is Staff Sergeant William Brown. I've been in the Guard for 29 years. There was a fear of the nuclear war, so yeah, a lot of people had camps inland. I think some people were already prepared, for the inland camps, already, stocked up with food and have a place to go to in case something ever happened, to survive, and there's always that survival. And in the past, I always survived, find a way to survive. So, something happened, we'll still survive.
John Schaefer is a retired adjutant general of the Alaska Army National Guard.
Alaska was different than other states because it had been invaded, because we had an effort in the war. The entire state was considered overseas. For the National Guard, it meant that we had a full-time mission, and our mission was to keep an eye on the Soviet forces.
During the years of hostility between the two nations, the soldiers of the Eskimo Scouts of the Alaska Army National Guard kept a wary eye open for Soviet ships, aircraft, submarines, and soldiers trespassing on U.S. territory.
I'm Major Mike Haller. I'm retired from the Alaska National Guard. I spent more than 35 years as a member of the National Guard and the active forces. We were the only state that wasn't supposed to pack up and go someplace, because our enemy was right here at our door and they could be here in a matter of minutes. Remember, the Guard was the human tripwire. Had they decided to wage some sort of a limited war on any scale here in Alaska, they would have had a very large surprise, not just in the large military formations that they would potentially meet, but in their very first encounters with people from the villages known as members of the National Guard.
Well, Nome was the headquarters for 1st Scout Battalion, which stretched at that time from just north of the Yukon River all the way to Kaktuvik up on the Canadian border. And of course there were companies, there was company in Kotzebue and company in Barrow, and then the platoons basically were the different villages along the line.
We fly or we float to most of our destinations. You can only drive to 7 of them. You have to fly or float to more than 110 villages we were located in.
I would guess that at least a third to 50% of the men in the village participated in the Guard. There's no question that the percentage of people who participate in the National Guard in Alaska is the highest in the nation. We have high regards for serving our country, our state.
It was come as you are, and in that respect, it's really like the original militia of the Revolution era. Were prepared to reach for the gun or go to the armory very quickly and go do the needful thing and defend Alaska. We have also, though, learned it was much smarter to find out where the enemy was, call in the appropriate forces, and then be prepared to deal with them that way if we humanly could.
When the Soviet Union detonated an atomic bomb, the situation escalated. The Soviets then deployed a large number of bombers to air bases above the Arctic Circle and eastern Siberia. The United States no longer had a nuclear monopoly. No longer did the U.S. have a secure offensive edge. Atomic weapons delivered by enemy bombers could now reach the American heartland in a matter of hours.
My name is Lieutenant Colonel Ed Strabel. I was advisor to the Alaska Army National Guard. Because of the Cold War and the Spetsnaz threat, the feeling that the long-range radar sites around the periphery of Alaska would be a threat, and the Spetsnaz, the Soviet equivalent of small unit attack elements that would try to knock out those facilities.
Many people have come to believe that Alaska was virtually an armed fortress, and indeed it was. Not only did the active duty forces have a large number of organizations here, especially the Air Force had more than 4 dozen very significant outposts across the state. You could say the heart of the defense of Alaska really rested with the Alaska Army National Guard.
They tested each other. They wanted to see that how long it will take for American or Russian side to respond, to the penetration of one or another country to the borders or into the country. And it almost was anecdotal. Sometimes the Russians just would land very briefly on the airport somewhere in Point Barrow and then just take off again and leave. And the US would do the same thing.
As a defense measure, early warning systems for high-altitude air attacks were put in place. However, this system was of little use for detecting attacks or recon missions on the ground. Up close and personal called for troops on the ground to stand eye to eye with their Soviet counterparts.
There was a lot of bear overflights, the bear bombers, and there would be a series of different signals that the Soviets would give off that we were detecting. We had forward operating bases for our F-15s, as well as they also had tankers, and they would go on up and escort these bear bombers as they flew along the boundary between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
And we used to have a lot of Russian bear planes, and bear will come from the west, fly over. They would play cat and mouse to our airspace, the Russian bear planes, and it was neat. I was watching our interceptors, how they used to just fly over, just try to make them turn around.
The Air National Guard over at Elmendorf Air Force Base has a wall full of stars. Each of those red stars represents each time that a Soviet aircraft coming into Alaskan airspace.
There was also, at the same time, evidence that the Soviets might be putting ground forces in different locations in Alaska. The big ones were coming out of St. Lawrence Island. There was reports of footprints that would magically appear on shore in the snow, go on in, and then disappear.
The U.S. island of St. Lawrence lies in the midst of the Bering Sea, some 200 air miles southwest of Nome. From the northwestern tip of the island to mainland Siberia is a scant 36 miles. The mere location of the island made it a natural hotbed of superpowered tensions, and several times played host to significant interactions between the two opponents, despite its isolation.
Alexander Akia. I live in Sibunga in my lifetime. I like my country. We watch whole island. South side, west side, east side. By dog sled, by walk.
Any suspicious activity or sightings of unfriendlies was radioed to battalion headquarters in Nome or Bethel, who relayed the information to Fort Richardson, located just outside of Anchorage, Alaska's largest city.
My name is Willis Walanga, son of John Walanga. I was born here in Gamble, and I was a bear in Yupik. We got in the National Guard in 1949 when the recruiter came from Nome. When I retired, I was Command Sergeant Major. Being in the National Guard, our daily activity was make any unusual reports to battalion headquarters. And we were called the eyes and ears of the Army.
They were considered the eye of the nation, keeping track of Soviet traffic, constantly on the watch, inveterately fearing that someday they may be taken over by the Soviet Union at that time. Gamble could see the lights of Novochapolino, so they knew they were only a step away.
The Cold War was not a battle with guns as much as it was sneaking around peeping in the other guy's windows. We call it espionage. High-flying surveillance missions, submarines snorkeling close to the coast, paratroopers making clandestine unseen landings, and mysterious foreign objects being found on islands and shores were all part of the spy industry.
Yeah, my name is George Nwook. I'm from Sibunga, Alaskan, St. Lawrence Island. During the Cold War period, we had to darken our windows during the night, what they call blackouts. And my father was in the Guard. They were involved in guard posts throughout the perimeter of the village.
The Eskimo Scouts, in many instances, they had people on out there for 2, 3, and 4 days, just in one spot. And they were calling in all kinds of good information. There were several aircraft that were spotted, low-flying aircraft that could be trying to fly under radar along the coast of St. Lawrence Island.
But we had radios, and we would report anything that happened. So whenever a plane or a submarine or a ship, a Soviet one, would be spotted somewhere, you could track it by the radio calls.
My name is Winnie James Sr. Almost every night, clear nights, the Russian MiG planes used to buzz right over our Army camp taking pictures. So we used to report them.
In the early years of tension between the two nations, ships above the Bering Sea were uneasy and tense. The fine line between interception and engagement was crossed in 1955 on June 22nd, when 2 Russian MiG aircraft engaged a U.S. Navy VP Neptune aircraft and sprayed the plane with machine gun fire. The aircraft, flying approximately 40 miles southwest of St. Lawrence Island, was able to crash land approximately 8 miles south of Gamble, one of 2 native communities on the island. Soon after the plane crashed, members of the Alaska Army National Guard detachment had mobilized and responded in their traditional walrus skin hunting boats.
My name is Ralph Apatiki, and my Eskimo name is Anahun from Gamble on St. Lawrence Island. Without knowing, we are ready. The boat is ready, the motor is ready, everything. Snacks are ready, and we're waiting for our uncle. Instead, we saw that airplane. And then our plan get different.
Yeah, my name is Simeon Otel, and I live in Gamble, Alaska. Tried to go save them. They went by skin boat, 2 of them, and they went there and go check them.
The native guardsmen brought medical supplies, warm soup, and tea, and successfully rescued all 11 members of the crew. Awards of merit were given to the members of the rescue party in Washington, D.C. Had it not been for the brave and quick actions of the guardsmen, some wounded crew members would not long have survived without medical attention.
My name is Kenneth Kingikok, but there used to be a lot of activities. We would have some strange people coming on the island. Most of the time it would be dark time, and pretty sure wherever they're coming from, they're here to collect intelligence.
The individual was out on a snow machine and got killed. His snow machine reportedly was never found. And the feeling was that he may have found a Soviet Spetsnaz team, was killed, they took his snow machine.
There was an initial search on the island by the troopers, by the Alaska National Guard members. There had been some talk about a Soviet vessel operating in or near the island. I think he was murdered. I believe that. I believe he was murdered by some Soviets.
We think that they may have been air-landed either by helicopter or possibly by parachute, and then moved overland to the ocean and were picked up possibly by a submarine.
The case is never solved. It is a cold case. St. Lawrence Island has often been the home of many Soviet artifacts and flotsam. Residents walking along the beaches have reportedly encountered numerous Soviet goods and military paraphernalia. Gas masks, rubber rafts, aerosol cans, batteries, and many other items clearly originating in Russia have turned up on the shores of St. Lawrence Island. Now, whether or not these items are of evidence of Soviet incursions on the island is still the subject of heated debate in many circles.
There were some items that were found. One was a large light bulb, and we're talking probably about 12, 16 inches long. It had Cyrillic writing on it, and it was found in a rocky area. We did bring back the light bulb and a Soviet chemical decontamination kit.
Found this sign, and it has a Russian writing. We didn't know what the sign was. Understand it was some kind of warning that you cannot go there or something.
Where we had a problem was in the sightings of submarines offshore, usually around St. Lawrence Island. An individual or two climbing up on the land, or they'd find footprints and radio batteries, sometimes radios, other gear, because those people would leave when the local guardsmen went to investigate. And then once in a while they'd recover a corpse on the island.
Any vessel, anything that is strange we see out there in front of us, and if it's not a seal, it's not a walrus, and if there's something that is a rod sticking out, I'm sure it got to be a submarine.
On the North Slope, there used to be a lot of submarine activity.
Well, you look at all of those, and we'd had, you combine these pieces then, and you see there's an increase of Soviet surface vessels in and around Alaska. You see that there is physical materials that's literally on our territory. And then you notice that the air operations have increased over a period of months. Well, it does provoke you to wonder, why are they doing this, and what's going on?
All kinds of mysterious things happened that the Guard was put to task to keep contact with. It was the Guard who was always given the lack of credit or credit for having to search these things out when they took place.
Alaskan winter weather is deep freeze friendly. It's an opportune climate to test boots, gloves, jackets, sleeping bags, and one's ability to chew frozen protein. Alaska is a custom-made training ground for winter military tactics.
America rolls back its northern frontiers. Near Fort Greely, Alaska, men and vehicles struggle through the biting Arctic winds and snow. Their mission, to find out how we shall fight in the Arctic should the need arise. Operation Moosehorn utilizes 10,000 men and is conducted in an area where temperatures of 68 below zero have been recorded this winter. Combat teams moved forward on skis. Transport planes deliver 400 tons of supplies to forward areas, while the steady advance of ground troops toward the enemy objective proceeds. Despite the bitter weather, the advance rolls relentlessly forward. Tents must be pitched on 40 inches of snow, slight protection against a 60-mile-an-hour polar blizzard. Should war come, the defenders of the Arctic Circle have been tested to the limit for their task.
I love it. I liked it. I enjoyed it very much, especially when we have the training here on the island and competing with some of the other more educated and trained people, such as SEAL teams or special forces. We were to transport them from here to Gamble by snow machine from here. And we were dealing with something like 40, 50 below zero, and wind chills were down to 75, 80 below zero. The first time they've been in a winter storm. With the kind of clothing you got on, you're not going to last very long, so you got to try to hurry up and get over to Gamble. And by the time we got to Camp Collier, about 17 miles west of here, and they were experiencing frost bites all over them, their knees, even where they have covered, their elbows, their fingers, their face. They were all catching frostbite. So we went to Camp Duphoek, where they had a cabin. So we lit the wood stove going, get them warmed up there, halfway between here and Gamble. It made me proud, for what the people are willing to do for their country.
That winter, it wasn't so much training as survival. It was really miserable, and we couldn't use our guns because they were frozen solid, our rifles. All of the rations we received were frozen. It's not so bad if you get peanut butter, and the milk's not bad frozen, and the fruit. But if you get something like Spam and eggs, it takes forever to heat them up on a Yukon stove. So we were out there for 6 days, as I recall. And we moved our camp probably 4 times in that 6 days. And we had the transportation unit from the Oregon National Guard providing our support for our movements from one location to another. And these vehicles that they were using kept breaking down, so half the time we ended up walking. These soldiers, if they had to perform, there was nobody could beat them in the cold weather operations. Back during the Cold War days, most of the attention was on the Eskimo Scout battalions because they were the eyes and ears of the military here in Alaska. They were our first line of defense. And I had the experience of visiting those units when I was the State Command Sergeant Major. You know, that was a real live situation. It was good for the Guard on one hand, and on another hand, it was rather troubling in some cases. One of the subjects that we drilled a lot on back in those days was chemical and biological threat training. It seemed like some of the Scout Battalion members weren't very concerned or interested. We were simply told that we don't have a gas mask for my wife or my children, so, you know, what good is it? And of course we were looking at it strictly from a military mission standpoint, and they were looking at it from their family, which opened up our eyes, I think, a lot. It's easy for an organization or a structure to forget about the rest of the people out there that are in harm's way.
I joined the Alaska Army National Guard in 1972. I enjoyed serving my country and did what I can during the Cold War. We were out hunting there and we saw this Russian ship. So we went after that smaller boat. And by the time we got to them, they all had their heads up against their boat like this. And one of the locals knew how to say hello to them in their language. Heard the word, they stood up right away and started shaking hands. And they knew we weren't going after them to hurt them or anything.
In addition to providing invaluable surveillance activities, the soldiers of the Alaska Army National Guard are trained in emergency response and are often the first line of aid for stranded hunters or downed planes in the remote Alaskan wilderness.
And both of the men are recovering from their 10-day ordeal on the ice. They huddled together for warmth as the storm blew them further and further out to sea. Their only food was a pound of reindeer meat. They praised the Army helicopter pilots who saved them. The weather now in the Nome area is clear, the present temperature 30 below, and the forecast for tomorrow is for more cold weather.
National Guard airplanes or helicopters were invaluable in these unforeseen circumstances and saved many a life.
The success of the Alaska Army National Guard would have been significantly hindered had they not been able to turn to the Alaska Air Guard for a lot of their transportation, their airlift capabilities.
Alaskan natives were trained in more than combat and surveillance. Education and planning, tactics, and implementation of objectives produced leaders who became CEOs of multi-million-dollar native corporations.
My name is Dennis McTrokin. Ended up working and serving as a guardsman for 30 years. My career with the National Guard, although it may not seem related to being the president of a native corporation, prepared me well for that. In running a corporation, you have to plan ahead. We have our strategic plans and then our tactical plans, just like a military organization would do.
Often history is capricious. Events happen that are not predicted. The earthquake of 1964 in Anchorage was such an event.
Just before the earthquake happened in March of 1964, all the troops from those scout battalions were here in Anchorage for an annual training. Think of it as a roundup of the National Guard. And so there were more than 3,000 troops here in Anchorage. They had just completed their training. It's nearly 5:30 in the afternoon and the earthquake hits.
Within an instant, they were immediately given duty by the governor of the state to go out and stand guard here and there to stop the pilfering. And it was fortunate we were in training at the time because it was instantly available.
You also had the Air National Guard at that point, and that's important too because between the two organizations they brought security forces immediately and to make sure that people had safe passage.
And it was never said, but there was martial law in Anchorage. Martial law, you know what that means. The troops took over. We were downtown Anchorage. If there was a need, our men would be helping because that's how we were trained, to offer help in a time of need. And there'd be no exception.
The Guard was the person who had people to get a job done. They were the lifeline when emergencies came up.
Another area of historical tension is the island of Little Diomede, a village outpost in the direct sightline of Russian territory. Nowhere in Alaska or the nation felt the military pressure of the USSR more than this tiny island located in the middle of the Bering Strait between Alaska's Seward Peninsula and Siberia's Chukchi Peninsula. Historically, the Siberian Inupiat have been connected as a people long before international boundaries were recognized.
There's a very painful story of a group of Diomeders, Little Diomeders, who have been arrested on Big Diomede on one of those visits. And they crossed this narrow strait between the two islands, preparing to go to East Cape, to this village of Naukan, which they normally visited. They were not allowed to go. They lived under arrest for about 3 or 4 weeks. A few people died, and that was the last visit.
Guardsmen who were visiting Big Diomede, was a Soviet island, were captured, and so they stayed there for several months before they were released to go back to Little Diomede. And so right off the bat we were involved in the Cold War.
Named Orville Akinga, Sr., and I'm from Little Diomede Island. They did not return like they were supposed to. So we start realizing there's something wrong. Something is wrong. But there was no communication between here and there. They were captured or retained, and they were kept on that island over there. Well, my father was one of them. After 52 days, they were returned. They were confined to one spot. According to the words he said, that he was interrogated by a Russian who spoke English very well. See what's on the island, see if there's any militaries around the area, and every little thing. He said, I was kept standing for hours, you know. Tried to convince me, the Russian was saying, tried to convince him that he's an American spy.
Robert Suluk, who was a member of the Alaska Army National Guard, recalls what it was like living in such close proximity to the Soviet threat.
On the top of the observation post, there were some troops up there. We've heard a number of shots. We've heard some English words saying, go back. They do give out warning shots when we get too close to the border.
And for 40 years, people lost any contact and any knowledge of each other.
Native Inupiat National Guard members living on the island during the Cold War were on constant alert to the actions of the Soviet garrison on Big Diomede Island. On Little Diomede, less than 3 miles from a Soviet military installation, Alaska Army National Guard members were constantly monitoring and relaying information to battalion headquarters in Nome concerning the Soviet activity taking place on the adjacent island. Suspicious activity or irregular flights to or from the island were a cause for alert, as were times of prolonged inactivity. As the Soviet system began to relax through Gorbachev's policy of perestroika and glasnost, tensions in the Bering Sea region also began to relax. Native groups on both sides of the Bering Strait lobbied their governments for limited access to relatives and relations on the other side.
I have a lot of relatives across there, probably about 4 villages.
These efforts culminated in several goodwill exchanges and friendship flights between Nome and Siberia. Exchanges and meetings of government representatives from both sides of the Bering Sea promised much for the native people of both countries. In another incident, the village of Gamble acted as impromptu host for a stranded Soviet Arctic research aircraft on February 27, 1974. The plane was caught in a strong headwind while returning to Siberia and lacked the necessary fuel to return to the USSR. The plane was forced to emergency land on the village airstrip, with one of the engines quitting on the final approach due to lack of fuel. While guardsmen attempted to contact authorities in Nome, the Soviet Embassy in Washington, D.C. contacted the U.S. State Department and the Department of Defense regarding the stranded plane. Meanwhile, the residents of Gamble provided the crew of the Soviet plane with space heaters and warm food and drink. While the Soviet crew was skeptical at first, relations warmed up quickly. An exchange of coins, watches, and other trinkets took place between the villagers and the crew. The U.S. and Soviet government reached an accord in Washington, D.C., and soon an Alaskan Air National Guard C-130 had left Anchorage with 900 gallons of JP-1 fuel for the stranded aircraft. The Soviets were refueled, and the plane was permitted to return to Siberia. The hospitality of the residents of Gamble was one of several gestures of civility across the Bering Sea that helped melt the ice curtain. On October 7, 1988, near the end of the Cold War, 3 California gray whales tarried too long in the Arctic feeding grounds and became trapped in the ice at Barrow. The natives of Barrow cut breathing holes in the ice, allowing the whales to get to deeper water. This was a first step in a cooperative effort between the United States using 2 National Guard Sky Crane helicopters and a Soviet Union icebreaker. This joint effort promised a new age of cooperation and peace between neighbors. The relative harmony of the region was a model for the rest of the world into the late 1980s. Then in 1989, the stability of the Bering Sea was momentarily shaken in a rash and brazen act. A U.S.-Soviet team of explorers had been approved to ski and dog sled from Siberia across the frozen Bering Sea into Alaska, thus completing the first Bering Bridge crossing since the fall of the ice curtain. At the historic moment when the team was to cross from Soviet territory into the U.S., an event that shocked both governments took place. A Soviet delegation of reporters and officials had flown from Moscow to record the historic moment. A similar U.S. delegation, comprised of Alaska's Governor Steve Cooper and reporters, was scheduled to attend, but poor weather grounded the party in Nome. While the team crossed the international boundary, 2 Soviet journalism students from Moscow approached a uniformed Alaska Army National Guard member and declared that they intended to defect from the USSR. The 2 students headed toward the village of Little Diomede with the National Guard members under the pretense of taking pictures and never returned. When the Soviet delegation prepared to leave, word spread that they were 2 members short. After several recounts, the delegation passed off the discrepancy as a miscount and took off. The actions of the 2 Soviet students had the potential to undo almost 40 years of work in the region to relax borders and allow for travel between native families and relations. Luckily, no serious ramifications resulted from the defection, and the 2 Soviet students were airlifted by the Alaska Air National Guard and granted asylum in the United States. The quick thinking of the Eskimo Scouts was instrumental in avoiding a serious setback in U.S.-Soviet relations. Another benefit resulting from the Alaska National Guard during the Cold War was the construction of over 100 armories built in native villages. These armories provided a space for the resurgence of native culture that had been opposed by the dominating tenants and schools of missionaries. The armories also were instrumental in advancing modern communication in the villages.
Those were back in the days when I joined. The National Guard armory in every village was generally the only place that had electricity.
The National Guard program had a very, very strong impact on the culture of Alaska Native people.
People that was maintaining and running the buildings were all local people, and they understood, the need for conducting these important cultural events. The Alaskan National Armories were the bigger buildings, and those were very important gathering places for community events. And communications between St. Lawrence Island and mainland Alaska and the Alaskan National Guard were the only means of communicating to the outside world. So those 2 are important contributions to our community.
These adaptations to other cultures became a natural process.
I'm of Aleut and Alutiiq and Russian descent. The Metrokan name is from the Kodiak area. Growing up, I felt we were Alaskans. We had a Russian heritage, but I don't think many of us or any of us really saw a connection with that day Russia, and most of us had the Russian background, were also Alaska Native, and we all understood that. I was baptized in a Russian church, married in a Russian church. My father spoke Russian. There was very little, if any, discussion of our native culture when I was growing up in Kodiak. In our region, at least, the culture seemed to start coming back. We had a dance team created in Kodiak, and over the years, we now have dance groups in every community in the region.
Before radio, television, and the internet, National Guard training took the Eskimo Scouts outside their villages, exposing them to Western culture.
The cross-cultural benefits would be being able to communicate more proficiently in English. Learning music was one. Being able to go out to different cultures and learning and adopting some of the techniques they learned when they were outside of our community and bringing back the knowledge they learned outside also contributed in that way to become more efficient and more self-sufficient in their own personal lives.
Good influence, a good influence.
We have our Inupiaq values, our list of values, respect elders, respect nature. And then I like to compare our Inupiaq values with our Army values, our military values, because they're almost the same, so, so they kind of work together to combine those, and it keeps my pride.
Indeed, the modern reputation of the National Guard is built largely upon the service and the traditions of those men and women who served during those many Cold War years.
In Barrow, Alaska, an Inupiat dancer dressed in his uniform celebrates the blending of cultures, signifying the Alaskan Scouts were protectors of the community and of national interest. This man's dance is a symbolic interpretation that merges not only cultures, but values dating from prehistory to the present. A wedding ceremony joining cultures presented an archway of whale baleen representing a gateway into a modern world of love that has the power to transcend new dimensions. Another positive benefit of the development of the Alaskan Scouts blended not only values and traditions, but merged families into an acceptance of each other's cultures by a natural evolution.
Welcome to the Army National Guard.
Thank Uncle Sam for supporting the National Guard. It's an important branch of our government. We not only stand to defend democracy, but we stand for peace. And we pray that we will always have peace.
Down through history, far more ancient than the modern West, the natives of the west coast of Alaska have been interacting across modern-day international borders. For thousands of years, Alaskan natives survived in one of the harshest places on the globe and reflect that hardy lineage in the modern world. They're the best scouts, hunters, and soldiers in their area of expertise. No other group is completely qualified to protect our northern borders. Subsistence lifestyles have created Alaskan natives who are wise in the ways of their lands and waters and experts in observation. For generations, seeing and hearing the immediate world around them was crucial to their survival. In addition to the survival skills they possess, the natives of Alaska's northwest coast have been mediators and goodwill ambassadors between nations. The Cold War's role of Alaska's Army National Guard Scouts was ready-made for these intrepid soldiers. The ingredients were already present.
Eskimo Scouts are a dying breed now. There's no more Eskimo Scouts. It'll be part of history now, and I was glad to serve, to be an Eskimo Scout and work with all the elite units of the armed forces and to help our country.